Hello, everyone. Guess what? We're early today. I feel like I've never been early before for one of these. There's always like a technical difficulty or a glitch, but David was early and the technology is working. So we are here early for you. Feel free to throw a comment in the chat. Let us know how your day is getting on. Can you see and hear us okay? So excited to be here with Dr. David Leah. David, I feel like between Leigh Miller, you, and Dr. Wednesday Martin, it's like the trifecta of knowledge on the areas we discuss in the group.
Well, they are both wonderful, brilliant people. I'm thrilled to just be in a circle with them. There you go.
In advance of our conversation, I was listening to some of the interviews you did on Dr. Wednesday Martin's podcast and with Justin Leigh Miller. It's just so fascinating, all of it.
Yeah, I mean, they get to do amazing stuff and spend all day researching and talking to people about, sex and kinky sex. They are fun people to have conversations with.
It's true. Yeah, I had actually, Dr. Justin Leigh Miller was the very first Facebook Live we ever did in the group.
Oh, very cool.
We started with a bang. I see folks joining in. Guys, let us know if you can see and hear us okay, if the audio is good, if the video is good, where you're tuning in from in the world, and we will dive in. So I first met David at Esther's 2018 Live Masculinity event in New York City. And I reached out to him last month because I was just so heartbroken after learning about Robert Aaron Long's mass shooting here in the US. So for anyone who's unfamiliar, last month, a shooter named Robert Aaron Long went to 2 different Asian-owned massage parlors that he frequented as a client in Atlanta, Georgia. And with a handgun, he fired shots that killed 8 people, 6 of whom were Asian women. And Long said he was motivated by a sexual addiction that was at odds with his Baptist religious beliefs. And he had previously spent time in an evangelical treatment clinic for sex addiction. Long viewed the massage parlors, which appeared in an online guide to brothels, as a temptation for him, and he wanted to eliminate that temptation. Long claims to have initially thought about killing himself, but instead decided to target the businesses to help others dealing with sex addiction. So I just wanted to pause there because I know it's a lot. And I'm just curious, David, what came up for you in hearing that story?
Well, to be honest, I predicted this one. The night before the statements were released about him being a sex addict, he had been arrested. We didn't know many details. We knew, shooting in Atlanta, young male, and that the establishments where the shootings were alleged massage, sexual establishments of some kind, etc. And I was having a conversation about it with a colleague who's a sex worker activist, and we were talking about the degree to which people who struggle with their sexuality externalize their fear and their anger at other people. And I said, I bet this guy's going to turn out to be a sex addict. I bet this guy's going to turn out to have been in sex addiction treatment. And I was confident enough in it that I wrote it down in a public tweet. And then sure enough, the next day, not even 9 hours after I said that, the information came out. And then people started asking me, well, why? What was it? And I said, it's exactly that. I said that people in the sex addiction industry teach people to hate and fear their sexuality, and even more so, to hate the people that make them feel sexually aroused. And so we see this with the particularly the porn addiction folks that they rage against the pornography industry, and they are actively now trying to get the porn Pornhub, for instance, shut down because they fear their own sexuality so much that they can't control it. And so they try to make the world a place where their desires can't be fulfilled. So I mean, and we've seen this for many years. I mean, think about all of the politicians and all of the preachers that rage against some form of sexuality, homosexuality, infidelity, pornography, and then they get caught engaging in exactly the same behavior. That unfortunately.
Can I pause you for a second? Because you said you had tweeted, I bet there's some sex addiction going on. And yet I know you've been pretty public about saying that you don't believe in sex addiction. Can you explain the discrepancy?
So what I said was that this guy is going to have a history of identifying as a sex addict.
Got it.
Because you're right. I mean, I don't believe that sex is an addiction, and I think that this is, in fact, a very counterproductive treatment strategy and ideology. Because, again, treating sexuality like a disease, treating sexuality like it's something you have to fight against, creates this adversarial relationship with your own sexuality. And it may actually paradoxically make it worse. That's an interesting thing. There's this fascinating study by Yaniv Efrati in Israel, where he showed that the more religious a person was, the harder they worked to not think about masturbation.
Right.
The harder you try not to think about masturbation, the more you think about masturbation, right? Don't think of an elephant. And if you do, you're a bad, rotten person. You should hate yourself. You can't stop thinking about a damn elephant now. And unfortunately, that is what the sex addiction model really encourages. It encourages us to go to war with our own sexuality. And unfortunately, not only does it make it worse, but what we see then is this polarization of the dialogue. We then see people turning this into a battle, into a war. And sadly, we see people engaging in violence related to their own sexual struggles.
Yeah. So let's put ourselves in Robert Aaron Long's shoes for a moment. What do you think was going on? If sex addiction is a myth, is it shame for having sexual feelings? Is it self-hatred? Is it like not feeling good enough and kind of redirecting it to being about sex when it's something else?
So, in 2012, I published my book, The Myth of Sex Addiction. And that came about after about a year and a half where I had interviewed people around the world. I read everything I could about the concept of sex addiction. And I was really trying to dive in and give it credit. Was it possible that the idea of sex addiction could be valid? And at the end of the day, I argued that the concept of sex addiction is largely a moral concept. It is morality, sexual morality, that has intruded into clinical thinking, and that most of the criteria used to diagnose sex addiction are based on cultural, religious, and moral ideas around sexuality, not clinical or scientific ones. My arguments have, in the intervening 9 years, have very largely been supported. There has been a tremendous flood of research over the past few years, now since roughly 2015, showing that the self-identification of sex addict is predicted not by how much sex a person has, but how they feel about it. And the prediction of sex addiction is being raised in a religious or moral household, where imagine that you have been taught that there's only a certain kind of sexuality that is acceptable or permissive, typically heterosexual monogamy. And now as an adult, you maybe have same-sex desires, you maybe have desires for sex outside marriage, you maybe engage in masturbation to pornography. have fantasies or sexual desires that you've been taught make you a bad person. And you now hate yourself, and you hate that aspect of yourself. You try and deny it, you try and resist it, you try not to think about it. And the harder you fight against it, oftentimes paradoxically, the more tempting it becomes,
Right.
the more taboo it becomes, the more exciting it becomes to engage in that behavior. And then afterwards you feel awful. You are overwhelmed with guilt and shame about your behaviors and about yourself, about your identity. When somebody identifies now themselves to me as a sex addict, I think I rephrase it in my head as, I am afraid of my sexuality. I have sexual desires that I wish I didn't have.
Yeah.
That's a different question. Now, that's a great clinical question, because now as therapists, we can engage in conversation around, well, why? Why do you hate yourself for having those desires? What about those desires make it not okay? And here's a very important question. Why are there other people that have those same desires or behaviors and they don't hate themselves? They're not afraid of them the way you are.
Right.
What is it that's different? When we understand those things, now we can start to examine the real conflict, because the conflict is, honestly, it's oftentimes not the sexuality, but it's between the person and their morality, their religion, their context, their relationship. I want more sex than my wife. I wish she wishes I didn't want sex as much as I do, and and that creates a conflict. It is very important clinically that we talk about the conflict. Unfortunately, the sex addiction model focuses us on the sex as opposed to the person. I want to talk about the person.
You could almost as easily just call it a shame addiction as you could a sex.
I have. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And the sad thing is that shame is ineffective as a behavioral control. And what shame does is increases, in fact, the negative consequences of these behaviors. Particularly when it comes to sexuality, most of the issues that I see and treat, the sexuality itself is not as much of a problem as the shame and the social consequences of that behavior. For instance, homosexuality, for years was treated as a disease, and interestingly, the first edition of first book on sex addiction phrased homosexuality itself as an addiction. A later edition took that out, but the reason why people who were gay struggled was because society told them not to be gay and that there was something wrong with them. And so for a while there was ego dystonic homosexuality in DSM, which was, you've got depression and anxiety because you're gay. Well, you've got depression and anxiety because you're gay because society has told you not to be. If we remove those social stigmas, those negative consequences go away. Robert Aaron Long and many people who identify as sex addicts, they are struggling. They really are in pain, and they deserve help. Unfortunately, sex addiction treatment, one of the dirty secrets is that after 40 years of the sex addiction treatment model existing, there is no evidence that it works. There is no scientific evidence that treating sex as an addiction is an effective clinical strategy. And there's a lot of evidence that it may make it worse.
And I mean, you look at, he went to an evangelical treatment center. So the same messages that were creating the shame and the sex addiction.
That's right.
Are probably going to be there too.
I mean, the interesting thing, there's some interesting research. Again, there's just been a flood of research around these issues, but there's some interesting research showing the degree to which particularly evangelical conservative religions in the United States, this is largely a United States phenomenon, have outsourced sexual morality now to a treatment industry. One of my good friends, Doug Barn Harvey, he tells the story about a guy coming to him and saying, look, I got caught, having gay sex, and my church is going to kick me out if I'm gay. But if I engage in this behavior because I'm a sex addict, then I can get treatment and stay in the church. And unfortunately, Doug said, the guy was gay. But that is the really interesting and frankly insidious intersection between religion and the sex addiction industry, that it is about enforcing conservative sexual morality.
Yeah. It's so ironic too, because most people are drawn to religious institutions as a way to be connected to community and to be embraced and to feel part of something. And how ironic that in the very act of doing that, you're
absolutely right. I mean, and to be clear, people who are in a religious community are at lower risk of developing mental health disorders or substance use disorders.
Right.
However, they are at heightened risk of developing a sexual disorder.
Wow.
Being religious is a risk factor for developing a sexual disorder. And
is that for all religions?
Yeah, interestingly, it is predominantly for most of the conservative religions, but I have seen folks, even from Buddhist traditions, struggling with sexual acceptance.
Yeah. It's interesting because I'm Jewish and I don't really remember getting any messages whatsoever about sex from.
Well, I mean, Dr. Ruth was Jewish. However, there are certain Jewish communities that are more Orthodox and conservative. Some Orthodox Jew communities prohibit oral sex, for instance. And then the interesting thing is, amongst Orthodox Jew viewers, oral sex pornography is the most popular. Because it's about the taboo, the thing that we condemn or prohibit, then becomes the thing that is really tempting and exciting for people.
100%. And this is a little bit of a non sequitur, but we had a woman, she was a former dominatrix in New York City, Kasia Urbaniak. Yes. And we had her on for a Facebook Live, and she was talking about her regular clientele. And she said a lot of them were Orthodox Jews. Yeah. Okay.
I mean, interestingly, and I know we're talking about these topics. My first book is called Insatiable Wives, and it's about the cuckolding and hotwifing community and fetish and fantasy and behavior. We see the same thing there, that cuckolding or fantasies of cuckolding are particularly popular in communities and cultures that embrace a high level of macho or machismo, very traditional masculinity. If you do Google Trends, you find that Italy is the country where they have the highest per capita searches for cuckolding. Because can
you define it for anyone who might be unfamiliar?
Cuckolding is the fantasy or behavior of watching your wife or sharing your wife with other men. And historically, since the 1500s or so in Europe, men who were cuckolds, whose wives cheated on them non-consensually, were banished, were shamed, were treated as though they're not a real man. If you remember a couple of years ago, the Republican conservative politicians started calling each other cuck because it was a way to say, well, you're not a real man, you're not a real Republican. The modern cuckolding, though, is consensual. It's usually promoted by the husband, who says to the wife, I'd really be interested in seeing you or sharing you with other men. Justin Lehmiller, you mentioned him, his book, Tell Me What You Want. And he found that roughly 45% of men report a fantasy of watching their wife or girlfriend with other men. So it's really popular. And the interesting thing is, the more the more you're told, a real man doesn't, a real man can satisfy his wife or girlfriend. She doesn't need any other man. It actually, again, incentivizes and energizes the taboo nature of this thing that then becomes really exciting.
Yeah. I can't tell you how many posts and anonymous posts we get from men on the topic who are super interested in exploring this. And I would say for the most part, a little bit of hesitancy on the part of their partners, their female partners. Is that pretty much what you found?
Yeah, typically. Historically, now I think that is changing some. I wrote that book in 2009, and it keeps being relevant. Jerry Falwell Jr. got caught in a kind of hot wife and cuckolding scandal recently, and my book resurfaced and got lots of attention. It is typically a fantasy that is introduced by the man. Oftentimes the wife is concerned that violating monogamy will result in consequences for her, that her husband wants her to be a slut and she doesn't, she's worried about slut shaming and all of that. That is changing somewhat, though. I am seeing more women now reporting that they have the fantasy or interest in this behavior independent of their husband. And Wednesday Martin, who you mentioned, her book Untrue explores some of that, and she's actually now working, I think, on a book about women who engage in cuckolding, which I think is really exciting.
Yeah, I think both Leigh Miller and you said it's like the most popular blog post on your site year after year.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, yeah. I have a Psychology Today blog, and the article that I wrote on that, I think it alone has like 2 or 3 million reads.
Yeah. Well, it strikes me though, when you look at ideas about male sexuality, the idea that a man has a wife or a partner who's attractive enough to be desired by another man, that would be seen as positive for him. Whereas let's say her male partner has kind of an unexpected negative reaction, that could actually be potentially damaging for the female partner. So I can see why those trends.
Yeah, in my book, I talked about one couple in Texas where the husband and wife picked up a guy at a bar and took him home. The husband sat in a chair next to the bed and watched the guy have sex with his wife. The wife got up and went to the bathroom, and then the husband reached into his chair, pulled out a gun, and shot the guy that had just had sex with his wife, and shot him in the back. He didn't die, but we can just imagine the emotionally wrought complexity there. Of the something you desire and hate, the shame, the guilt. There it is again, right?
Yeah.
However, I mean, the research that has been done, there's not been a lot of research on this, suggests that it can be a healthy behavior, it can be a healthy fantasy, so long as the people are healthy. And again, that takes us back. I mean, it's the same message that I say in the sex addiction issue, is that we get distracted by sexuality. I call it the sexy shiny object syndrome, where when there's a sexual issue, we over focus on that. We chase that. We blame that for everything, leading us to ignoring the person. And it is when people are healthy, oftentimes their sexuality is healthy.
Right.
When people are unhealthy, oftentimes their sexuality is unhealthy. Let's talk about the person. And that's where, particularly as a therapist, that's where I want to go back to, and in talking about how people can be healthy. Because then we end up spending less time talking about, well, that's good sex or that's bad sex. Let's talk about let's talk about a healthy person. That is how we help these people. So, for instance, Robert Aaron Long. We can imagine, we're speculating, that, he was a guy who struggled with moral conflict, high levels of anxiety, probably lots of rumination, lots of struggles to accept himself. we can help that guy and those issues by addressing those struggles. There's really interesting research from Rory Reed that found that people with higher levels of self-compassion were less likely to identify as sex addicts and less likely to struggle with their sexual desires. And that's one of the things that I share with a lot of patients, is that the more you struggle with it, oftentimes the more powerful these issues or urges become. What if we worked instead towards acceptance, accepting that these aspects, these desires are part of yourself? That doesn't mean you have to act on them, but the more we can accept them and acknowledge them as part of ourself, the greater level of self-control we often have.
Yeah, because I kind of see self-compassion as almost the opposite of shame. Or
absolutely, yeah. I mean, shame is trying to make something go away. Shame is, wishing that you could take a spoon and just, cut that part of your sexuality out. Self-compassion and acceptance is acknowledging, hey, this is a part of myself. Now, what does it mean for me as a person to have that, and how can I accept that?
Yeah.
Because the more we can accept that in ourselves, then we can have healthy ethical negotiations with our partners.
Yeah. I want to go back to a couple different things that you just shared. The first is, I thought of Esther's first book, Mating in Captivity, where she talks about people are often never more drawn to their partner when they're looking at them from a close distance and being an observer. And so I could see that element of or cuckolding being super attractive.
Oh God, yeah. I mean, these people, the reclaiming sex, they say, is some of the best sex they've ever had in their life. Mm-hmm. That, seeing now your partner as somebody who was desired by somebody else, who was just had sex with somebody else, it triggers, this evolutionary biological kind of competitiveness. But it also, changes, again, the way that you see your partner, because we get used to our partners. And all of a sudden, when our partner is desired by somebody else, it's like, whoa, they're really hot. Mm-hmm. I forgot how hot they were. Interestingly, I mean, many of these couples that I've worked with, they use sex with other partners to supercharge 100%. Their own sexuality within their relationship, and it really is incredibly adaptive and clever. I mean, it's a fascinating kind of thing. I mean, interestingly, I'm talking a lot about Republicans. I don't know why. Well, around this topic, it comes up. But Paul Manafort, who was Trump's president of his campaign or something like that, I think he just got out of prison for it, or whatever. There was a hack of his daughter's cell phones, where they had a text conversation about, apparently Paul Manafort liked to watch his wife have sex with other men, and that apparently Manafort struggled with erectile issues until he watched his wife have sex with other men, and then he could get it up just fine. Yeah. And again, there is this just fascinating self-manipulation around these, around the mechanisms of these desires.
100%. Such creativity too.
Yeah, it really is kind of brilliant.
Yeah. It's funny because I'm polyamorous, and one of the themes that comes up a lot in the discussions that I'm a part of is this idea of a one penis policy. And, we were talking before about like rules and trying to kind of contain the temptation. And this is almost like the opposite. So one approach is we're going to have a one penis policy. So if we're ethically non-monogamous, we're only going to, we'll only allow women to be a part of our play. And then this approach is kind of the opposite. It's like, I'm just going to fully lean into the potential
Yeah.
discomfort or feelings that come up.
When I work with, consensually non-monogamous folks, I oftentimes refer to those rules as anxiety management strategies. And it can be really, really useful to look at those rules and then have a dialogue around the anxieties that are leading to you creating these rules. I think it is oftentimes a roadmap to how to help people navigate potential conflicts, and have a more authentic, honest relationship. I see a comment that I'd like to respond to, that where somebody asks, how much of this is also a bit homoerotic, and I would say a lot of it, in some cases. Now, we're talking about actually, again, this conversation is true with regards to both cuckolding and sex addiction, because many cuckold men have some somewhat suppressed bisexual desires, and they use their wife's body basically as a vehicle for them to have vicarious sex with another man. Hey, I didn't have sex with him.
Right.
You did. I just watched and really enjoyed it. Right. I'm not gay.
Right.
Or
they go down on her after she's had penetration with a guy.
Exactly. Or they're forced by the dominant wife to engage in oral sex with the man. Hey, I'm not. I'm bi. She made me do it.
Right.
The interesting thing, though, also in sex addiction, again, I mean, all of these things in my thinking, all of these threads really kind of go together in fascinating ways. Gay and bisexual men are at 3 times the risk of being labeled sex addicts.
Yeah.
And oftentimes, again, remember, most sex addicts come out of religious traditions. There are more sex addiction treatment facilities in religious areas of the country. Sex addiction and porn addiction are diagnosed much more frequently by religious therapists. And these are folks who are teaching that heterosexuality is healthy, homosexuality is a sin. And so then anybody in those traditions that experience those desires, again, they fight them. They go to war with them, viewing them as a disease.
Yeah.
Which then again creates that shame. And paradoxically, greater levels of struggle with self-control. The higher levels of shame in these people predict greater feeling of discontrol. But it's really, really important to know that sex addicts and porn addicts don't actually watch more porn or have more sex than anybody else. They feel worse about it. And and in fact, in many cases, there are swingers and men in the gay leather community, for instance, who have more sex than these sex addicts ever dreamed of having.
Right.
But they don't have problems with it because they've integrated it consciously and ethically, let's hope, into their lives in a responsible way.
Yeah. And I could see how being able to explore their bisexuality in a safe, consensual space could be like super healing and positive for those feelings, rather than just denying them. Everyone's consenting to it, and that could be really healthy and positive.
Yeah, there's an interesting thing that happens in people that watch pornography and people that engage in particularly swinging, that they become more accepting of sexual diversity in other people.
Yeah.
And my theory, my clinical argument around this is that seeing other people enjoying sex that you might not enjoy or that you were taught you shouldn't have breaks down some of those ideas that there's one right kind of sex and it's my kind. Anything other than my kind of sex is automatically bad. But when you see these people having fun, and I call it the lightning didn't strike phenomenon, because they, lightning didn't come from the heavens and they didn't die, nothing bad happened. It starts to break down again some of those really rigid ideas that we are taught around sexuality. I mean, one of the things that I tell a lot of people is, many of us of a certain age, were raised with very racist and very sexist kind of ideas as children. And as adults, we have largely rejected those. How did we do that? Well, society moved away from those kinds of rigid, negative kind of attitudes and values, and we moved with it. And so, as society is becoming more accepting of sexual diversity, we are moving with it. However, there are communities, religious communities in particular, that are really, really panicked right now because they're seeing society shifting away from their sexual values. And so they're doing things like, passing laws that say that pornography is a public health crisis, because they are trying to contain the changes around sexuality. But it's a losing battle. Unfortunately, they're becoming more and more desperate as they're losing ground.
Yeah, 100%. There were two other notes that I wanted to share about cuckolding. The first is that there can sometimes, not always, but sometimes be an element of humiliation where the man who's engaging with the woman will shame or humiliate the partner who's watching. And, it's interesting, like going back to the conversation with Kasia Urbaniak, she said most of the work that she does starts from this place of shame. Someone had an experience generally in childhood that was really embarrassing and has created a lot of shame. And she basically replays it and gives it a new ending in a way that's super healing. And is that something that you see, that when humiliation can take place within this safe, consensual container, some of the wounds from the past can be healed?
Absolutely. I mean, first, I mean, there are different flavors of cuckolding and wife sharing and female-led non-monogamy kind of. Some of them involve humiliation, some don't. It's really interesting. Leopold von Sacher-Masoch, masochism was actually named after him. He liked to be beaten and whipped by beautiful women. Who doesn't, really? But he one time, this is in the 1800s in Europe, he posted an ad in a German newspaper looking for a virile young man to befriend his wife. Mm-hmm. Because he, like Craigslist of the day, or like Tinder today, right? And he wanted to experience the humiliation of being cuckolded. And there is something kind of freeing almost for people who experience that humiliation, that overwhelming kind of urge. They almost roll around in it.
Yeah.
And then it ends.
Yeah.
We're told that these feelings are so shameful that if you experience them, you'll die. Yeah. Right? And then you don't. Yeah. There's this really interesting kind of new phenomenon now, maybe not all that new, but we're hearing about it more now, called small penis humiliation, SPH. Mm-hmm. And again, it's men who enjoy being shamed for having a small penis. The fascinating thing is many of these guys actually don't have small penises. Mm-hmm. Their penises are normal to average size or more, but they have been told that, having a small penis makes you not a man. And being humiliated in that way is a chance to escape from the burden of being a man, being in charge. Roy Baumeister is a social psychologist who researched this, and he said that masochism and submission and humiliation is an escape from self. Mm-hmm. It's an escape from the burden of having to maintain the boundaries of your identity. And it's like a vacation.
Totally. This is like such a weird analogy, but I am obsessed with group classes, fitness, dance, yoga, the like. And I had when I was talking with Kasha Urbaniak, I was telling her about the owner of the pole studio that I go to. And I was describing her, and Kasha said she is like a class A dom. And it struck me, the reason I love going to these classes so much is I can be submissive and I can just like receive like being led and being held by someone else. And it's not an experience that I have on a regular basis outside of classes. And I'm like, oh, this is like the equivalent of me going to the dungeon a few times a week.
Yeah. And the sex and sexual behaviors are not different from other human behaviors. That again is one of the things that one of the underlying, I think, assumptions that we make to our peril, particularly around sex addiction, with the idea that sex is uniquely different from all other human behaviors. But it's really not. And in my book, Myth of Sex Addiction, I started this one chapter with a description of how, a couple of times a week, I like to go to this, room that has pads, and I roll around with these sweaty men. And I made it sound all sexy. Well, really, I'm describing martial arts. Yeah. I work out, I do Brazilian jiu-jitsu. Yeah. But and the thing is, the endorphins, the oxytocin, the neurochemicals, the physiological responses, the testosterone, for instance, released in my body, is almost the same between engaging in jiu-jitsu and engaging in group sex. Now, we can identify that sex, particularly within relationship, etc., does have some unique elements. But then, I love the way that polyamory has really taught us to look at the ways in which we love. And, you can only love one person. Well, I love my kids too. Well, that's different. Why is it different? Right? Those are the really sophisticated, kind of nuanced conversations that I enjoy having, because it pulls us away from this rigid, it must be this way, and if it's not this way, everything else is wrong.
Right. Yeah. The reason it's different is because culture has told us it's different.
Right.
Yeah. There was one other thing you said a little bit earlier that I thought was so fascinating. So earlier we were talking about how when something's taboo, we're never more drawn to it. In fact, taboo was the topic of Esther's annual event this year.
Oh, cool. Yes.
And then you were talking about rules and polyamory and how they're often anxiety management tools. And what's so interesting is I prefer not to be in a primary relationship. And so I'm often the person who's engaging with a primary couple. And so often rules will be presented to me. And the irony is, like, think about any rom-com plot. It's like attraction plus obstacle. And so even like rules have the opposite effect, where you want it that much more.
Yeah. Jack Moran has a lovely book called The Erotic Mind, where that's exactly some of the stuff he talks about the obstacle makes sexuality more appealing. From a neurochemical standpoint, more dopamine is released in our brain when there are more obstacles, because the harder we have to work to accomplish something, the more our brain basically thinks, okay, I need to remember this because it was a lot of work to get this. So more dopamine is released to increase our ability to remember this thing. So the obstacles actually increase our learning, increase our excitement, increase the attention we give to things. We can all recognize that the things in our lives that take more work mean more to us.
Right. And there's also this amazing cognitive bias called reactance, which is anytime, and we see this with little kids all the time, anytime they're told, don't do that, that's the thing that they want to do, right? So it's kind of the same idea.
Which is also kind of insidious, right? Because it is a hell of a business plan to create future business by telling people not to do something, knowing that they're going to come back to you for treatment because they did it.
Totally.
I wish I was that clever.
100%. There were two additional topics that I wanted to touch on related to Robert Aaron Long. So tragically, almost daily, there's an instance of Asian hate in the news. And as I shared, Asian massage parlors were targeted, as well as the victims of the shooting, and the people who were killed were majority Asian. How much do you think racism or Asian hate, if at all, played into this mass shooting?
There's been a lot of dialogue about that, and I hesitate to speculate, about specific motives. But for me, I don't think it has to be one or the other. Because Asians and Asian women are so often kind of sexualized and created as kind of sexual objects in a lot of pornography or fantasy, that could have played a role again in his level of self-hatred, particularly if, as in many, and I'm a white Southern boy, my family's from Tennessee and Georgia, that many white Southern religious, families are also relatively racist, with values or ideas around not having interracial relationships. Mm-hmm. That also would create increased kind of struggle. Again, it's funny how this conversation like blends the two topics, because within the cuckolding fantasy, there's a lot of dialogue around racism there as well, because many cuckold fantasies involve white wives with black men. Yep. And there's a lot of dialogue around, is that racist? Well, it certainly has racist elements, and it certainly reflects the racial struggles within us and within our society. That some of these men will fantasize about the other man being a black man, because they have the idea, oh well, my wife would never leave me for a black man. Oh. Well, maybe she would, but then also it also reflects our social history and our American history of fetishizing black men in sexual ways. And so the issue for me is that it's not that these fantasies are racist, but that they reflect the struggles with racism in our society. Because again, I think in a perfectly non-racist society, I bet there wouldn't be many race-based fantasies.
Right.
Justin again talks about this in his book Tell Me What You Want, where he found that he found different patterns of people fantasizing about people of other racial partners, other racial demographics, etc. And he argues similarly that the differences in these things really reflect how we are approaching race, and again creating those obstacles. If you're not supposed to have interracial sex, does that potentially increase the excitement of that fantasy? Because again, reactance and the taboo nature of it.
That was actually my first thought when you mentioned the trend of an African American, I guess, is it called a bull?
Sometimes that language is used,
to me, it was like, oh, the taboo nature of it. Because if you think back to, 200 years ago, the idea of a white woman and a black man together was like the ultimate taboo.
Yeah, and there's some interesting history there that, freedom went through the mother's line. And so if a white male had sex with a black female slave, the children would be slaves. But if a black male had sex with a white female, slave owner, the children would not be slaves. And so again, these are complicated pieces of history that are still in our, genetic and social and our sexual makeup. I think that the more we can have compassion with ourselves for these pieces of history being there, the more we can understand them, the more we can make healthy decisions. One of the men I interviewed in my first book, Insatiable Wives, was a black man who had sex with lots of wives, and he said, he said the sex is great, but he said sometimes I feel bad because if I run into the couple out in public, they act like they don't know me.
Yeah.
And that hurt. Yeah.
That's also, as a polyamorous, that's something that I really need to consider when I'm exploring a new relationship, is that scenario,
Am I a dirty secret?
Exactly. Right. Yeah. Okay. So this is a little bit of a heavy question, but I'm feeling inspired to dive in. So the police captain in Robert Aaron Long's case, his name was Jay Baker. And he said in a press briefing, Robert Aaron Long was pretty much fed up and at the end of his rope. I guess it was just a really bad day for him, and this is what he did. And recently, an article was shared in our group that depicted George Floyd's murder as an example of a man, meaning the police officer Derek Chauvin, simply being overtook by his emotions. I think the intention behind the second statement is that society teaches men to suppress their emotions, and then when they erupt, we chastise them. It's like this idea of a double bind. I feel that in both of these statements, they really minimize the violent acts and shirk responsibility and accountability. And I'm curious to hear your thoughts.
As a man, I'm responsible for my actions. And for instance, one of the things that I was really struck by during a lot of the dialogue around the shooting in Atlanta was remembering all of the cases of girls in high schools and middle schools being told they can't wear spaghetti strap dresses.
Right.
Because if their shoulders are, visible, that it might inspire uncontrollable lust.
Right.
in males. And many women I've talked to told me that, in religious, training in schools and stuff like that, they were taught not to be the downfall of a man. And
yeah.
I personally just, vehemently reject the idea that my self-control is so fragile, and that if I erupt violently, or if I succumb to sexual temptation, that it is as much the fault of that stuff out there as it is mine, or even more so them. Again, that's one of the things that I really struggle with, all of this externalization, this external locus of control that they're putting on men. And I don't think of myself that way. I didn't raise my son that way. My son is not raising my grandson that way. That, we are not completely, perfectly in control, but we're also not so fragile either. I think that the more we can accept the feelings that we have, and that is the one kernel of truth that I will, kind of go along with in there, that men are taught not to express emotions, and then they, and anger oftentimes is the only emotion that men are allowed to kind of express, because that's a manly emotion, I guess. I don't know, but I see many men in therapy who have never even learned how to recognize their own emotions, and they are afraid that if they feel the emotion, that it will take over, just like the men that I was talking about before with humiliation play and stuff like that, that they're afraid that emotion will kill them, or that they won't survive it. Again, the more we can have compassion and self-acceptance for our feelings, for our failings, for our flaws, the better men we can be, and the better choices we can make.
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't think I shared this earlier, but when you were talking about being humiliated in a consensual sexual scene, it reminded me a little bit of exposure therapy. Right?
Absolutely. In fact, I mean, I make that analogy really often, actually, that, for instance, one patient that I worked with a deathly fear of spiders, and I sent her, because I don't do exposure therapy, but I sent her to a cognitive behavioral therapist that worked with her specifically on that phobia, and helped her learn that this thing that she was so terrified of, actually she could survive. And the really interesting thing was, as the spider phobia diminished, we saw ripple effects. We saw her ability to take that lesson and now transfer it and translate it into other places of her life, where she now started seeing, oh, this thing that I've been avoiding really isn't that bad, and I can survive it, right? In my agency, we do lots of substance use work, and we use a strategy called urge surfing for people that have a craving for drug or alcohol, because oftentimes the craving comes up, and they try to avoid it. They try and make it go away, or either by using or by kind of acting really out of control. And we teach people to just kind of sit there with the feeling. What's it like to sit there and, wow, I'd really like to drink right now. And I see you taking a drink because I made you think about it. And they find that oftentimes these feelings that feel really, really strong only last 20 minutes.
Yeah.
But we've been so afraid of it.
Yeah. Isn't that like the length of a feeling, just like kind of biologically by definition? Is there not? They go away. It's like a wave.
That's right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. It feels like it's going to feel like this forever, but it doesn't.
Yeah. That's
I see there was a question, about the Proud Boys. There's a funny clip you guys can watch of me on the Daily Show, actually talking about the Proud Boys. And they have the Proud Boys have a specific, quote, no wank rule, where guys are not supposed to masturbate. Although the founder of the Proud Boys, a guy named Gavin McGinnis, he somehow got my email, and he started sending me these raging, probably kind of, under the influence emails in the middle of the night for about a week, where he said, look, it's not that Proud Boys can't masturbate, but they have to be within 1 yard of their female partner if they want to masturbate, and she doesn't want to have sex. That's okay. And it just, again, all these rules.
Yeah.
And all these rules about what it is to be a man. If you masturbate and your partner's more than 3 feet away, then you're not manly enough. Is, again, just all these strange rigidities.
Yeah. I wanted to end with, continuing on the topic of manhood, your latest work. I was excited to see that you're exploring the stories of people who engage in sexual misconduct professionally, and why people choose to why people in power cross sexual lines. I'd love to hear a little bit more about the cases you're exploring and your point of view on this.
So, it's interesting that for about 15 years now, I've been, I serve on a couple of national committees that review on licensure issues, licensure dings, problems, et cetera, for therapists, psychologists, psychiatrists, et cetera. And so I've seen sexual misconduct, at these professional levels for many years. We also see it, we see it in teachers, right? Those young female Texas teachers who get caught, having sex with their 15, 14-year-old, male students. We see it with police officers.
Politics, for sure.
We certainly see it in politics, right? And I think that there are lots and lots of motivations and flavors here, but one of them is that temptation. One of them is
it goes back to taboo.
One of them is the taboo. This line is the one you shouldn't cross. And what's interesting, my wife is a teacher, and I've talked to her about this, and I said, look, in your training as a teacher, do they talk to you about developing erotic feelings for students? And she said, absolutely not. She said they tell you don't do it, right? But that's it. And I think in difference, the good training that happens for therapists teaches us to acknowledge and recognize, erotic countertransference, that, it is not, just an automatic refer the patient away. It can be, therapeutic beneficial, but it teaches us to have compassion for those feelings. Now, I'm not saying all therapists, that no therapist ever, screw their patients. Of course they do, but that it leads me in those directions of exploring the self-compassion. Of course, there's also issues of narcissism and antisocial issues that come up. But interestingly, I think that sometimes that narcissism is socially induced. Maybe that's a good label I should use. Socially induced narcissism with these celebrities that get caught, like Matt Gaetz right now. The sexual scandals with him, and these celebrities who are put on this pedestal and kind of told they can kind of do anything, and they have all these people throwing themselves at them. And one cop I interviewed talked about this. He said, they gave me the keys to the candy store, and then they fired me for eating the candy. Right. Yeah. And so, I'm hoping I write that book, it's because I think it would be really interesting to have conversations and explore the complexity, explore the nuance, and explore the human issues that lead people to cross these lines. Yeah. The first example that came to mind for me was Andrew Cuomo. And I was, I watched every press briefing. I was a big fan. And, when I learned about, obviously it's still under investigation, but there are a lot of accusations out there. And I think what you touched on, this idea of, Andrew Cuomo was really put up on a pedestal during the pandemic. Right. And then that coupled with the taboo-ness of exploring that, even just kind of like dancing on the line of what's okay and what's not. I mean, I can see just from a human behavior standpoint how it would happen. Now, I'm blanking on his name. Who was the previous New York governor that had the sex scandal with the call girls? I'm blanking too, but So he, in his autobiography, or by one of them, he actually talked about the fact that during that scandal, he was encouraged by his advisors to come out as a sex addict and to go to sex addiction treatment and what I call sex addiction summer camp. Yeah. That'll make this thing go away. You can blame it on the sex addiction. Everybody will say, okay, he's better now. And he said that from his years as a prosecutor, he was unwilling to do that. He was unwilling to avoid responsibility for his behaviors.
Right.
And ultimately, obviously, you know, his career ended from that. But again, it ties a lot of these threads together, that rather than embracing the idea of sex addiction, rather than denying responsibility for his behaviors, he had compassion for himself, that he'd made mistakes that he regretted, and took responsibility for them. That while I might not agree with the personal choices that he made, there is some adult maturity there that I can admire and acknowledge as counter to the sex addiction, blame everybody else kind of thinking.
Yeah, 100%. Well, I will be looking out for that book when it comes out, or whatever form it takes, your research that you're doing. I think it's super important. Thank you so much for everything that you shared, your insights on the mass shooting that we talked about, and the intersection between shame and violence and sex, cuckolding. Really, really appreciate your wisdom and your time. I linked up some of your books if people are interested in exploring more, and just so grateful for everything that you shared today.
Well, thank you. Thanks for having me. Good conversation. I appreciate the community that is kind of created around you know, Esther and her work and this thinking. I think that's how we change our industry and the thinking about mental health, sexuality, relationships, with the kind of nuanced, sophisticated exploration that you're encouraging here. So thank you.
Thank you, David. We'll catch you soon, hopefully in person at some point.
Hopefully one day soon. Bye-bye now.
Thanks again. Bye.